The weary single-dad janitor spotted the tiny detail the doctors missed, and in doing so, he saved the life of a secret billionaire's only son in a matter of minutes. "Get this filth out of my sight before he contaminates the entire wing." The rain hammered down on the glass roof of the atrium like 1,000 desperate fists, a relentless and wild symphony of sorrow that echoed the storm inside Leo's own hollow chest. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the vast, sterile corridor of the Blackwood Children's Wing for a split second before darkness swallowed it whole, leaving only the soft, amber hue of the emergency lighting to guide his worn-out cleaning cart. He was a ghost in this gleaming palace of healing, a silent witness to both profound grief and fleeting miracles. Every squeak of his cart's wheels on the polished marble floor seemed to echo the unspoken prayers that saturated the very air of the place, a place so much like the one where he had lost everything. His heart thudded with a familiar, weary rhythm. He pushed onward. Leo's hands, though chapped and calloused from years of thankless labor, moved with a dignified, steady grace as he wiped down a gleaming chrome handrail, his reflection a pale, gaunt specter in its polished surface. He saw the threadbare collar of his uniform, the haunted look in his eyes that had taken permanent residence the day his wife, Sarah, had taken her last shuddering breath, and the deep lines of exhaustion etched around his mouth from working 2 jobs to keep a roof over his daughter's head. His sweet Maya, a small, laminated photograph of her, all gap-toothed smile and bright, innocent eyes, was tucked safely inside the breast pocket of his shirt, a sacred talisman against the crushing weight of his despair. He could feel its crisp edge against his ribs, a constant reminder of his purpose, the one pure light in his shattered world. He paused, his cloth hovering over the metal. A deep sigh escaped his lips, misting in the cold, antiseptic air. He just had to make it through another 4 hours. He rounded a corner into the exclusive pediatric ICU, a wing so lavishly funded by its mysterious benefactor, Alistair Blackwood, that it felt more like a 5-star hotel than a hospital. The silence here was different, heavier, more sterile. It was the kind of silence that was paid for, a buffer against the raw, untidy chaos of ordinary suffering. In a plush leather armchair just outside the hermetically sealed glass doors of the main suite, a man was slumped, a figure of such profound brokenness that Leo froze in his tracks. The man's clothes were simple, a rumpled cotton shirt and faded jeans, and his hair was a mess, as if he'd been running his hands through it for days. His face, illuminated by the flickering green and blue lights of the monitors inside the room, was a mask of brittle agony. He wasn't crying. He was far beyond that. It was a state of being Leo recognized with a seismic jolt of shared experience. It was the face of a man watching his entire world splinter into pieces. The man didn't move. Leo felt an undeniable pull, a kinship of grief that transcended their stations. He knew he should keep moving, that his job was to be invisible, to erase any sign that the messy business of life had occurred on these pristine floors. But he couldn't. He saw the man's hand, which had been dangling limply over the arm of the chair, unclench, and a small, worn teddy bear with one button thudded softly onto the marble. The man didn't seem to notice. His unwavering gaze was fixed on the small, fragile form of the child in the bed, a boy entangled in a web of wires and tubes. Leo's own heart clenched. He thought of Maya, of the unbearable fear that sometimes seized him in the dead of night, the terror of something happening to her, of being left truly and utterly alone. That fear was a living thing in this hallway. He could taste its metallic bitterness on his tongue. Overcoming a lifetime of being told to keep his head down, Leo quietly pushed his cart aside. He bent down, his knees cracking in protest, and picked up the little bear. The fabric was worn soft with love, the scent of a child clinging to it. He walked over to the stranger, his footsteps making no sound on the polished floor. He held out the toy. The man finally broke his vigil, his eyes slowly focusing on Leo. They were hollow, haunted pools of gray, shimmering with unspoken pain. For a long moment he just stared, first at the bear, then at Leo's outstretched hand, and finally into Leo's eyes. In that shared gaze, a universe of understanding passed between them. Leo offered no words, no empty platitudes. He just stood there, a fellow traveler in the barren wilderness of loss, offering this one small, returned comfort. The man's hand, trembling slightly, rose and took the bear, his fingers brushing against Leo's. The contact was brief, but it felt strangely profound. A raw, unspoken acknowledgement. "Thank you," the man whispered, his voice cracked and hoarse. It was barely a sound. Leo simply nodded, his own throat tight with emotion. He didn't know it yet, but this moment would change everything. Suddenly, a shrill, piercing alarm shattered the heavy silence. A cacophony of beeps and alerts erupted from the boys' room, a frantic digital scream. The glass doors hissed open and a team of doctors and nurses in crisp blue scrubs swarmed in, their voices sharp and urgent. "He's crashing. BP is dropping fast. Oxygen sats are plummeting. Push another amp of AP." The man, the boy's father, shot to his feet, his face turning a shade of pale that was terrifying to behold. He was pushed back by a stern-faced nurse. "Sir, please, you need to wait outside. We're doing everything we can." Leo, instinctively backing away with his cart, found himself pressed against the opposite wall, an unwilling spectator to the unfolding nightmare. His janitor's uniform rendered him invisible, a piece of the scenery. But he wasn't just seeing the chaos. He was observing. It was what he did. It was how he'd learned to survive, by noticing the details others missed. He watched the frantic movements, the way the head physician, a tall, arrogant man with silver hair named Dr. Harding, barked orders. They were focused on the machines, on the numbers flashing across the screens. But Leo's eyes were on the boy. He was so small, so fragile amidst the technology. And then he saw it. It was a tiny thing, almost imperceptible. A faint, lace-like purple mottling appearing on the boy's fingertips, a pattern known as livedo reticularis, and a slight, almost imperceptible twitch at the corner of his left eye. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, surfaced from the depths of his mind, from a life before this one, a life when he was a paramedic trainee, before Sarah's illness had forced him to drop out and take any job he could find. He remembered his instructor, a grizzled old veteran, drilling it into them. "Look at the patient, not just the monitor. The body tells a story the machine can't." The mottling, the twitch. It wasn't a cardiac event. It was anaphylaxis, a severe allergic reaction. His gaze shot to the four-pole, to the bag of clear liquid dripping steadily into the child's arm. A standard sedative. But some people, a very small percentage, had a violent, life-threatening allergy to it. It was happening right now. They were killing him with the cure. He had to say something. His heart pounded against his ribs, a wild drum of fear and certainty. He took a hesitant step forward. A nurse, rushing past with a crash cart, shoved him back. "Out of the way!" she snapped, not even looking at him. He saw the father, his hands pressed against the glass, his face a mask of desperate helplessness. He saw Dr. Harding preparing a defibrillator. They were going to shock him. That would be the end. The boy's heart would just give out. "No," Leo whispered to himself. The word caught in his throat. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't stand by and watch another family be destroyed in a place that was supposed to offer hope. He pushed off the wall, his purpose clear and unwavering. He strode towards the open doorway, his voice, when it came out, louder and steadier than he could have imagined. "Stop!" he yelled, the word echoing in the suddenly silent corridor. It's not his heart. It's the sedative. He's having an allergic reaction. Look at his hands. Dr. Harding spun around, his face a thunderous mask of fury and disbelief. His eyes narrowed, taking in Leo's worn janitor uniform with utter contempt. "Who in God's name are you?" he snarled, his voice dripping with condescension. "And what did you just say?" The other medical staff froze, their attention diverted from the dying child to this unbelievable interruption. The air crackled with tension. "I said, look at his hands," Leo repeated, his voice trembling but firm, pointing a shaking finger towards the small boy. "The mottling. It's anaphylaxis. You're pushing an allergen directly into his bloodstream. You have to stop the drip." Now, a younger nurse's eyes darted from Leo to the boy's hand and back again. A flicker of dawning comprehension crossed her face. She had seen it too, but hadn't processed it in the panic. She opened her mouth to speak, but Dr. Harding cut her off with a venomous glare. He took a menacing step towards Leo, his face flushed with rage. "Are you a doctor? A nurse? No, you are the janitor. You push a mop. Your medical opinion is worth less than the dirt you sweep from my floors." The words were like physical blows, sharp and cruel, designed to humiliate and dismiss. "You have interfered with a critical medical procedure. You have endangered a patient's life with your ignorant babbling." The father, whose name Leo still didn't know, looked from the doctor's furious face to Leo's desperate, sincere one. He saw the unwavering certainty in the janitor's eyes, a stark contrast to the panicked chaos of the professionals. "Listen to him," the father said, his voice a low, commanding growl that cut through the tension. "Just look." Dr. Harding shot him a look of pure disdain. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but this is a highly complex situation. We do not take medical advice from the cleaning staff." He turned back to Leo, his lip curled in a sneer. "Security," he bellowed. "Get this filth out of my sight before he contaminates the entire wing." Two burly guards appeared as if from nowhere and grabbed Leo's arms in a firm, painful grip. The humiliation was a biting cold that seeped into his bones. They began to drag him away, his worn boots scuffing on the pristine floor. But as they pulled him past the doorway, he locked eyes with the young nurse again. He saw the conflict, the fear, the flicker of professional duty warring with her instinct. "It's the propofol," Leo managed to get out, the name of the drug suddenly clear in his memory. "Check for a propofol allergy in his chart. Please." The nurse hesitated for only a second. Then, while Dr. Harding was still berating the father, she moved with quiet efficiency. She lunged for the four-pole, her fingers quickly closing the roller clamp, stopping the flow of the sedative. Then she grabbed an ampoule of epinephrine from the crash cart and injected it swiftly into the boy's thigh. The effect was almost instantaneous. The violent alarms began to quiet down, replaced by a steadier, more regular beeping. The angry purple mottling on the boy's skin began to recede. A collective gasp went through the room. The boy's oxygen saturation numbers on the monitor, which had been dangerously low, started to climb. 75, 82, 90, 95. A ragged, collective sigh of relief filled the room. The boy was breathing easier. He was stable. He was alive. Dr. Harding stared at the monitor, then at the four-bag, his face a mixture of shock, disbelief, and dawning horror. He had almost killed the child, and the janitor had saved him. Leo saw none of this. He was already being frog-marched down the long, sterile corridor, the guards' grips like iron bands on his arms. He didn't struggle. A profound weariness settled over him, heavier than any fatigue he had ever known. He had done the right thing, he knew that, but the cost was immense. As they passed the administration office, the night supervisor, a woman with a permanently sour expression, stepped out, a pink slip already in her hand. "Mr. Nowak," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion, "your services are no longer required. Your interference in a medical emergency is grounds for immediate termination. Collect your personal effects from your locker. You have 5 minutes to vacate the premises." She didn't meet his eyes. She just thrust the paper at him. He took it with a numb hand. Fired. Of course. He was just a janitor. What had he expected? A medal? He was escorted to the staff locker room, the guards watching him as he slowly packed his few belongings into a worn backpack. A half-eaten sandwich, a thermos of cold tea, and the small, precious photo of Maya. He took one last look at the place that had been his prison for the last 2 years, a place of ghosts and gleaming surfaces. Then he turned and walked out into the pounding rain, the automatic doors hissing shut behind him with a soft click of finality. He was gone. Back in the ICU, the father, Alistair, finally pushed past the stunned medical team and rushed to his son's bedside. He gripped Julian's small hand, tears of relief streaming down his face, tracing paths through the grime and exhaustion on his cheeks. He turned to the young nurse who had acted. "Thank you," he choked out. "You saved him." She shook her head, her own eyes glistening. "It wasn't me, sir. It was the janitor." He knew Alistair's head snapped up. He looked around the room, then out into the empty hallway. "Where is he?" he demanded, a new urgency in his voice. "I need to thank him. I need to know his name." A heavy, awkward silence fell over the room. Dr. Harding, his face pale and clammy, avoided Alistair's gaze. The night supervisor cleared her throat nervously. "He was dismissed, sir. For protocol violation." Alistair's eyes, which had been soft with relief, now hardened into chips of ice. The grief-stricken, disheveled father vanished, and in his place stood someone else entirely. Someone with an aura of quiet, commanding power. "Find him," he said, his voice low and dangerously calm. "I don't care what it takes. I want his name. I want to know everything about him. Find the man who saved my son." A palpable fear entered the room. The staff suddenly realized they had not just dismissed a janitor. They had wronged the savior of Alistair Blackwood's only heir. And Alistair Blackwood was not a man known for his forgiveness. The next few weeks were a blur of desperation for Leo. He searched for work relentlessly, but the termination for gross misconduct on his record was a black mark he couldn't erase. His meager savings dwindled to nothing. The landlord's notices turned from polite reminders to angry, red-lettered threats of eviction. The biting cold of fear was a constant companion, a knot in his stomach that never loosened. He skipped meals so Maya could eat, telling her he wasn't hungry, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. He'd sit in their small, threadbare apartment, watching her play with her few worn toys, and his heart would feel like it was being squeezed in a vice. He had failed her. He had failed Sarah's memory. He was at the end of his rope, the quiet dignity he had clung to for so long beginning to fray into brittle despair. One evening, he returned from another fruitless day of job hunting to find a final eviction notice taped to his door. He had 72 hours. He slumped against the door, the paper crinkling in his trembling hand. It was over. They would be on the street. A sob caught in his throat, a raw, ragged sound of a man completely and utterly shattered. The next morning, as he was trying to figure out which of their few possessions to sell, a crisp white envelope slid under his door. There was no stamp, no return address. His name was written on the front in elegant, printed script. With numb fingers, he tore it open. Inside was a cashier's check from a bank he'd never heard of, made out to his landlord for the exact amount of 3 months' rent. And a simple, typed note. A good man should not have to worry about a roof for his child. There was no signature. Leo stared at it, his mind reeling. A mistake? A charity? He called the landlord, his heart pounding. The man confirmed, with grudging surprise, that the check was legitimate. The rent was paid. Leo sank into a chair, the note trembling in his hand. It felt like a miracle, a breath of air in a suffocating room. But who? Why? The mystery was unsettling, but it was overshadowed by the profound, overwhelming wave of relief. For the first time in weeks, he could breathe. The anonymous interventions did not stop there. A few days later, a large, unmarked van pulled up outside his building. 2 men delivered 3 enormous boxes to his door. They were filled with high-quality groceries. Fresh fruit, vegetables, meat, things he hadn't been able to afford in years. There were also brand-new clothes for Maya, beautiful little dresses and sturdy shoes, and a collection of toys that made her gasp with delight. Another note, in the same typed script. A child's laughter is the most sacred sound. Leo was bewildered. His initial relief now mingled with a growing unease. He felt watched, as if some invisible force was observing his suffering and selectively intervening. It was kind, undeniably so, but it was also unnerving. The final, most significant act came a week later. His old, rickety car, a rust bucket that coughed and sputtered with every turn of the key, was gone from its parking spot. In its place stood a gleaming, new, and utterly safe-looking family sedan. The keys were in an envelope on the driver's seat, along with the title and registration, already signed over to him. The note this time was just 4 words. For your peace of mind, Leo stood in the street, staring at the car, a symbol of a life so far removed from his own it felt like a dream. He was grateful, so deeply grateful he could weep. But he was also afraid. This was not charity. This was something else. A debt was being paid. A debt he didn't understand. Meanwhile, Alistair Blackwood, using the full, terrifying scope of his resources, had learned everything about Leo Nowak. He had his entire life laid out in a slim file on his ornate, polished desk. His exemplary paramedic training record, the tragic story of his wife's sudden illness, his subsequent financial spiral, his spotless work history until the termination, his deep and selfless devotion to his daughter. Alistair read it all, and the awe he had felt in that hospital corridor deepened into a profound, almost sacred respect. This man, Leo, was the embodiment of a purity and goodness Alistair had long ago dismissed as a childish fantasy. In a world that was transactional and cruel, Leo was genuine. He had acted not for reward, not for recognition, but simply because it was the right thing to do at immense personal cost. Alistair saw Leo's kindness not just as the act that saved his son, but as the act that had reawakened his own shriveled heart from a long, bitter winter of grief and cynicism. He knew he couldn't just write a check. That would be an insult. He had to know this man. He had to understand him. So he arranged the anonymous gifts, a way to alleviate the immediate suffering his own arrogance, by proxy of Dr. Harding, had caused. And then he planned to meet him not as a billionaire benefactor but as a father. Just a father. He found them at a small, public park on a sunny Saturday afternoon. Leo was pushing Maya on a swing, a genuine, unburdened smile on his face that made him look years younger. Alistair watched from a distance for a long time, his own son, Julian, now healthy and rambunctious, holding his hand. Finally, he took a breath and walked over, his heart thudding in a way it hadn't for years. He was dressed simply, in jeans and a sweater, the picture of an ordinary dad. "Excuse me," he said, his voice quiet. Leo turned, and his smile faded slightly as he registered the familiar face. Recognition dawned, followed by confusion. "You're—" Leo started, his voice trailing off. "I'm Julian's father," Alistair said, gesturing to the boy beside him. "We never got to properly thank you. This is Julian. Julian, this is Mr. Nowak. He's the man who saved your life." The boy looked up at Leo with wide, curious eyes and gave a shy wave. Leo's gaze softened, all confusion vanishing, replaced by a gentle warmth. He knelt down to Julian's level. "It's very nice to meet you, Julian. I'm so happy to see you looking so well." Alistair gestured to a nearby bench. Could I buy you a coffee? I feel I owe you so much more than that. But it would be a start." Leo hesitated, then nodded. They sat on the bench, the 2 children playing together on the grass nearby. Their easy, innocent friendship a stark contrast to the heavy weight of memory that hung between the 2 men. They sat in a comfortable silence for a moment, watching their sons. "The rent," Leo said finally, not as an accusation, but as a quiet statement of fact. "The groceries, the car. That was you." Alistair didn't deny it. He just nodded, his gaze steady. "It was the least I could do after what you lost because of me. Because of my hospital." "You don't owe me anything," Leo said softly. "I just did what anyone would have done." Alistair turned to him, his eyes filled with a raw, profound emotion. "No," he said, his voice thick. "That's the point. Not anyone would have done it. In a room full of the best-paid experts in the country, you were the only one who was truly paying attention. You were the only one who saw my son, not just a set of numbers on a screen." "Why?" The question hung in the air between them. Leo looked down at his worn hands, then back up at Alistair. "Because I know what it's like," he began, and the story of his life, of his grief, poured out of him. He spoke of Sarah, of their love, of her sudden, shocking diagnosis. He described the helplessness of watching her fade away in a hospital bed, surrounded by beeping machines and well-meaning but detached doctors. He spoke of the promises he'd made to her, to always protect Maya, to always be a good man. His voice cracked as he spoke, the pain still as raw as it was the day she died. He wasn't speaking to a billionaire. He was speaking to another man who had sat in that same chair of helpless vigil, whose heart had been shattered by the same indifferent cruelty of fate. He confessed his deepest fear, that he was failing, that her memory would be dishonored by his inability to provide for their child. It was a confession of profound vulnerability, a baring of his weary soul. Alistair listened, his expression unwavering, his gaze never leaving Leo's face. He didn't offer platitudes or interruptions. He simply listened, providing the rare and sacred gift of his complete attention. He made Leo feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in a very long time. When Leo finished, his voice a hoarse whisper, Alistair didn't speak for a long moment. He simply reached out and placed a hand on Leo's shoulder, a gesture of simple, solid, human connection. Then he began to speak, and it was his turn to share his own tragedy. He spoke of his wife, Eleanor, a vibrant, brilliant woman who had been the architect of their shared life, the heart of their family. He described the car accident, the sterile silence of the phone call in the middle of the night, the impossible task of explaining to a 4-year-old boy that his mother was never coming home. He confessed his own failure, how he had retreated from the world, burying himself in his work, building a fortress of wealth around his grief, becoming a ghost in his own life, a hollow man just going through the motions. "When I saw you in that hallway," Alistair said, his voice low and intense, "I saw myself, but when you acted, when you risked everything for a stranger, you showed me what I had become. A coward. You didn't just save Julian's life that night, Leo. You saved mine. You reminded me that there is still goodness in this world, that a person's character is the only thing that truly matters in that moment." On a simple park bench, two lonely, grieving fathers forged a bond over their shared sorrow, a connection deeper than any they had known since they had lost their wives. It was the beginning of a profound healing. A week later, Alistair called Leo with a proposal. He had been thinking about what happened, about the systemic arrogance that nearly cost him his son. He was establishing a new, multi-million-dollar charitable foundation, the Patient Advocacy Foundation. Its sole purpose would be to empower patients and their families, to ensure that no voice, no matter how small, was ever dismissed again. And he wanted Leo to run it. "Me?" Leo stammered, completely stunned. "I'm a janitor. I don't have a degree. I wouldn't know the first thing about running a foundation." "You know everything that matters," Alistair insisted. "You know how to listen. You know how to see people. And you have an unflinching moral compass. I don't want a bureaucrat, Leo. I want a man of character. I want you." He asked Leo to meet him at the hospital the next day, to be formally introduced to the board of directors as the new executive director. Leo, feeling a mixture of terror and a dizzying, unfamiliar hope, agreed. He arrived at the hospital the next day wearing a new, crisp suit that Alistair had sent over, feeling like an imposter. Alistair met him in the lobby, a reassuring smile on his face. "Ready?" he asked. Leo nodded, his heart pounding. They walked together towards the executive boardroom, a cavernous, ornate space with a long, polished table. As they entered, Leo saw that the entire hospital board was assembled, along with the senior medical staff. And there, at the head of the table, being praised by the hospital chairman, was Dr. Harding. He was in the middle of a self-congratulatory speech, taking full credit for his innovative and decisive handling of the Julian Blackwood case. His eyes swept the room, and then they landed on Leo, standing hesitantly in the doorway next to the man he still only knew as Julian's father. Dr. Harding's expression soured instantly. He stopped his speech mid-sentence. A cruel, arrogant smirk spread across his face. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Look what the cat dragged in. I thought we had the sanitation department take care of our trash problem." The board members looked confused, murmuring amongst themselves. Dr. Harding puffed out his chest, clearly enjoying the moment. He pointed a finger at Leo. "This man is a former employee, a janitor, who was fired for gross insubordination and for recklessly endangering a patient with his ignorant meddling. I had him removed myself. He turned his venomous gaze on Alistair. And you, sir, while I appreciate your gratitude for my saving your son, I must question your judgment in bringing this person into a professional meeting. Security, he barked, snapping his fingers. Please remove this man from the boardroom. He does not belong here. The entire room was silent, watching this public humiliation unfold. Leo stood frozen, the blood draining from his face. He felt small, worthless, just as he had that night in the corridor. He wanted the polished marble floor to open up and swallow him whole. But then, Alistair moved. He didn't raise his voice. He simply took a step forward, placing a protective hand on Leo's shoulder. He calmly surveyed the room, his icy gray eyes landing on Dr. Harding with an intensity that made the arrogant doctor falter. That will be all, doctor, Alistair said, his voice quiet but carrying an undeniable weight of command that silenced the room instantly. The hospital chairman, a portly man named Mr. Davies, cleared his throat nervously. I'm sorry, I don't believe we've been formally introduced. Alistair's gaze shifted to him. No, we haven't, he said smoothly. My name is Alistair Blackwood. Total silence. The name echoed in the cavernous room like a gunshot. Jaws dropped. Dr. Harding's face went from smug red to a pasty, sickly white. The chairman looked as if he was about to faint. Alistair Blackwood was not just a name on a building. He was the sole benefactor, the silent, invisible power that owned nearly every brick and machine in the entire institution. Alistair let the shock settle for a moment before he continued, his voice calm, measured, and utterly devastating. Dr. Harding, you are correct about one thing. Mr. Nowak is a janitor. A man who, with nothing more than his own 2 eyes and a sense of decency, did what you and your entire team of overpaid specialists failed to do. He saved my son's life. He then recounted the events of that night in meticulous, chilling detail, his voice never rising but each word landing like a hammer blow. He described the missed symptoms, the arrogant dismissal, the near-fatal mistake with the defibrillator. He described how Leo, at the cost of his own livelihood, had screamed the truth, and how a young nurse, to her credit, had been the only one with the courage to listen. You speak of meddling, Alistair said, his eyes boring into the now trembling doctor. The only meddling I see is your ego, which is so vast it prevented you from seeing the truth right in front of your face. You didn't save my son. You nearly murdered him. And then you tried to take credit for the heroism of the man you publicly humiliated and threw into the street. He paused, letting the condemnation hang in the air. So, yes, someone will be removed from this hospital. But it won't be Mr. Nowak. He turned his gaze to the chairman. Dr. Harding's employment is terminated, effective immediately. His medical license will be reviewed for gross negligence. And his pension is forfeit. The words were delivered like a death sentence. Dr. Harding simply crumpled into his chair, speechless and utterly destroyed. Alistair then turned his attention back to the stunned board. This incident has revealed a deep systemic sickness in this institution. A culture of arrogance where status is valued more than a patient's life. That ends today. He then announced the formation of the Patient Advocacy Foundation, funded with a personal endowment of $100 million. And its new executive director, he said, his voice ringing with pride as he squeezed Leo's shoulder, is the man who taught me what real character looks like. Mr. Leo Nowak. He had not just saved Leo. He had elevated him, vindicated him, and in one swift, powerful move, completely and irrevocably reversed their worlds, leaving their tormentor shattered in their wake. The salvation was complete. In the quiet aftermath, long after the disastrous board meeting had been adjourned and the disgraced Dr. Harding had been escorted from the building, Leo and Alistair stood alone in the now empty boardroom, the late afternoon sun slanting in golden shafts through the tall windows. Leo was still reeling, his mind struggling to process the seismic shift that had just occurred in his life. He looked at his hands, half expecting to see the calluses and stains of a janitor, but instead, he saw only the cuffs of a crisp new shirt. He felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the ground beneath his feet was no longer solid. He looked at Alistair, the powerful, commanding man who had just dismantled a man's career with a few quiet words, and saw in his eyes the same gentle, grieving father he had met on a park bench. I don't know what to say," Leo stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you isn't enough." Alistair stepped closer, his expression soft and sincere. "There's nothing to thank me for, Leo. I was simply setting things right. Justice is not a gift. It's a debt that must be paid." He paused, his gaze searching Leo's. "The job is real. The foundation is real. I need you, your voice, your perspective. It's what's been missing. Not just from this hospital, but from my life in that moment." The space between them was charged with unspoken emotion. It was more than just gratitude or friendship. It was a profound, undeniable connection forged in shared trauma and mutual respect. Alistair confessed everything then: how he had his security team find him, how he had orchestrated the anonymous gifts to ease his immediate burdens, how he had been watching over him and Maya from a distance, ensuring their safety. "I couldn't just write you a check," Alistair explained, his voice thick with feeling. "That's what the old me would have done. A transaction. But what you did for me, for Julian, it wasn't a transaction. It was a gift of pure, selfless humanity. It woke me up from a long, dark sleep. How could I repay that with something as sterile as money?" He reached out, not touching Leo, but his hand hovered in the space between them. "I spent years building walls around myself, Leo, and you, a quiet man with a mop and a good heart, you walked right through them without even trying. I don't want to go back to living behind those walls." His confession was clear. This wasn't just about a job. It was about building a new life. "I don't want to face this world without you and Maya by my side," he said softly. It wasn't a declaration of romance in the traditional sense, but it was a declaration of something far deeper. A promise of family, of partnership, of a shared future built on a foundation of healed and hopeful hearts. Leo, his eyes glistening with tears, he no longer had to hide, simply nodded. For the first time since Sarah was gone, he didn't feel alone. He felt home. 1 year later, the golden glow of a perfect autumn afternoon filled a sprawling, sun-drenched garden. Laughter, clear and bright, echoed through the air. A little girl with a gap-toothed smile, her dress a blur of color, chased a slightly older boy across a perfect green lawn, their shrieks of joy a perfect melody. Maya and Julian, they were not just friends. They were siblings in every way that mattered. Watching them from the stone terrace of a stately, beautiful home was Leo. He was no longer the gaunt, haunted man from the hospital corridors. He wore a comfortable linen shirt, his face relaxed and filled with a quiet, steady happiness. The weariness in his eyes had been replaced by a warm, gentle light. He was the respected and effective director of a foundation that had already changed countless lives. A man who had found his purpose not in cleaning up messes, but in preventing them. Beside him, Alistair stood, his arm resting comfortably around Leo's shoulders. The cynical, grief-stricken billionaire was gone, replaced by a man at peace, a man who had learned to laugh again. They watched their children play, a comfortable silence between them, the easy intimacy of a shared life. Framed photographs of two beautiful, smiling women, Sarah and Eleanor, sat on a table nearby, not as painful reminders of loss, but as honored architects of the family they had become. Their love had not been forgotten. It had been woven into the fabric of this new, beautiful life, a testament to the enduring power of the heart. The two men, two fathers, brought together by tragedy, had built a new world from the ashes of their old ones, a world filled with hope, security, and a profound, unwavering love. This story is a powerful reminder that heroes are not defined by their wealth or their titles, but by the quiet dignity of their actions and the selfless compassion in their hearts. It shows that a single, unsolicited act of kindness, born from pure empathy, can set in motion a chain of events that heals wounds, rights injustices, and builds a future more beautiful than one could ever have dared to imagine. A janitor's quiet observation saved a life, but his sincere goodness saved a soul, proving that the most profound value lies not in what we have, but in what we are willing to give of ourselves. If this story touched your heart and reaffirmed your faith in the goodness of people, we hope you'll continue to follow our journey. We believe that stories like Leo and Alistair's are not just tales of fiction. They are reflections of the incredible capacity for love and redemption that exists within all of us. For more soul-stirring stories that celebrate the triumph of the human spirit, please like, share, and subscribe to Soulful Love Tales. Your support allows us to keep creating inspiring content that warms the heart and uplifts the soul. We'll see you in the next one.